Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to A Better World, and I'm your host, Luis Acevedo. And today, the article that we'll be covering is from Human Progress, and it's titled, America is Relatively Safe and Tolerant. Now, the reason I wanted to cover this article today is because in today's world, especially what the media is portraying, is that America is still very racist and very bigoted, especially, the half of the country who voted for our president, or especially those things. And the data suggests otherwise, that while there is issues with racism and bigotry, it is not as big as a deal as it is portrayed to be. Now, by no means am I trying to downplay racism in any kind of way, because it is definitely something that we should work towards eradicating. However, in my humble opinion, I feel that that would be difficult simply because we are tribal beings and racism is a form of tribalism. So some people will always flock to that. It's not right by any means, and I'm not trying to justify it, but just wanted to make that point. Now, jumping into the article, the beginning of it has nothing to do with racism. Now, it starts off with talking about Steven Pinker, who I'm sure some of you have heard. He is a Harvard professor. He teaches psychology. And in one of the books that he has written, I believe it's called A Better Nature of Our Angels. I believe that's what it's called. Sorry if I'm butchering that. And in there, he describes how the world is a much safer place today than ever before. And so a couple examples that they had in the article are that in 1450, the Italian homicide rate was 73 per 100,000 people. Now, in England, it was much lower at the same time. However, it was still tremendously higher than where it's at today. It was at 13 per 100,000 people. And so what he illustrates here is the gradual decline of violence from century to century. So if we fast forward to 2011, what we see is a dramatic drop in the homicide rate between England and the United States. Now, England was at 13 per 100,000 people. Now, it's at 1 in 100,000 people. And the United States is at 4 in 100,000 people. So, the reason I wanted to start off the episode with this as well is because not only is racism and bigotry becoming an issue in America, well, not becoming an issue, but it's being portrayed to be a bigger issue than what it is, but also is violence, in that mass shootings and murders are occurring like rapid fire. At least that's the way it's illustrated. And regardless of your take on it, as far as gun control, whatever, that's irrelevant. All I'm talking about here is the data. And so in this article, the data suggests that homicide rates and mass shootings, homicide rates have gone down dramatically, and mass shootings, to be a victim of a mass shooting is extremely rare. So, for example, 89 people, by the time this article was written, which I believe was in 2017, 89 people died in America due to mass shootings. Now, that's tragic. And to lose any time a life is lost to anything, it's sad and it's horrible. And if there's a way to prevent it, we should work to prevent it. So, continuing, the likelihood, however, of being a victim in a mass shooting is 1 in 3.6 million. That is the odds of being a victim of a mass shooting. Now, according to the National Weather Service, the odds of being struck by lightning is 1 in 1.2 million. So statistically, your odds of being struck by lightning are much greater than being a victim of a mass shooting. Now, they're both very unlikely to happen, but if you had to make a bet, if you were going to be a victim of a mass shooting or struck by lightning, you should place your bet on being struck by lightning. Even though probably you lose your money either way because they're both so unlikely. They're the anomaly. So, and then, after we get past the mass shooting and violence in the world, through this article, it dives into another important aspect, and that's what we were talking about earlier, and that is the racial tension in America today. Now, what we see is the same kind of patterns as the homicide rate. And what I mean by that is the gradual decline in racism through in America as we've progressed into where we are today. So, as we all know, after the Civil War, lynching was commonplace in the Jim Crow South. However, it quickly plummeted over the coming decades, and by the mid-20th century, it was pretty much obsolete. Nobody was doing it anymore, and it was just gone. It was away from the culture. So although we had a long time of that happening and that horrible treatment that was occurring to African Americans simply for the color of their skin, it didn't take long after the Civil War for us to completely eradicate lynching. Now, I do realize that there was still a lot more progress to be made after the fact, but that just illustrates that there was growth. It's something I've noticed with a lot of things in life, is that there is incremental steps that lead to huge results. So essentially, with the homicide rate, the way it has declined, you could say in a way it's exponential growth for safety, and you could also say the same thing for lynching, that it became tremendously safer for African Americans as we've progressed after the Civil War. Now, to go into segregation a little bit, because that's another thing that was involved in that era, and is a huge, and it plays a huge role in American history. It's something that cannot be avoided when you talk about America, and most other countries too, I believe, because unfortunately we were just the last ones, one of the last countries, if I'm not mistaken, to get rid of slavery. But a lot of the other Western, world countries had slavery as well. But here, particularly in America, when it comes to segregation, in the year 1942, over half, 68%, almost 70% of Americans, white Americans, I need to be specific here, white Americans believed separation for schools between white and black. So white kids could go to their own school, black kids can go to their own school. There should be no intermixing, no interracial relationships. Almost 70% of white Americans believed this in 1942. But we fast forward to the year I was born, 1995, and that dropped down dramatically. By 66% was the decline in the belief in segregation. So, I'm sorry, it was 64%, decline of 64%. And in 1995, only 4% of white Americans believed that segregation was still a good idea for public schooling. Now, if we go back into 1958, what we find is also a little disheartening, and that is 45% of white Americans, so almost half of white Americans, and mind you, even today they make up a bulk of the population. So back then they made up probably a larger percentage than they do today. Now, I'm not one to play the identity politics, but I think it's important to show how we've progressed in this realm. So, 1958, almost half, 45% of white Americans said that they would move from their neighborhood if a black person moved there. 45%, so almost half of them said that they would move if a black person was to move into their neighborhood. Now, you fast forward to 1997, and once again, you see a huge decline in that mindset. You see a decline of 43% within 39 years. So only 2% in 1997 of white Americans believed that, had the same feelings as they did in 1958, where if a black person was to move in their neighborhood, they would move away. Dropped down to 2%. Now, we still, compared to some of the world, we still have higher levels of segregationist attitudes in the U.S. And this was noted by a 2014 World Values Survey. And they found that 6% of Americans were opposed to racially different neighborhoods. Now, that includes not just white Americans, but black Americans as well. So if a white person was to move into a black neighborhood, the black neighborhood would strongly dislike that. And vice versa, if a black person moved into a white neighborhood, the white people would strongly dislike that. But that's only 6%. It's only 6%. So it's not that large, and it's definitely a huge improvement from where we were before in the way we think and the way we view people. Now, do want to know, even though that we ranked kind of low on that, we were still higher than some other first world countries such as like Germany, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Japan. So we're still ranked better than them. And although America's belief in segregation is at 6%, which means that there's a few million people in our country who share this attitude and this mentality, I think it's important to note that it is still significantly better than what it was in the past. Hell, even 50 years ago, it's significantly better then. But if we look at other countries in today's world, we'll see that we are significantly better than a lot of other countries as well. So, for instance, if you look at Libya has 55%. So more than half of their country still holds a segregation belief in which there shouldn't be racially integrated neighborhoods. Now, Palestine is at 44%, India is at 41%, and Thailand is at 40%. So these countries have a lot. In their culture, it's a lot more common to still believe in segregation. Now, although we still have a lot of issues we need to work out as a country, and by no means am I trying to downplay racism at all, or the mass shootings or murder or violence in any kind of way, but rather shed light on the improvements we're making and how we've come a long way in a short amount of time. In a very short amount of time, we've become more open-minded, and I believe this is going to continue. This is going to continue to happen to a point where hopefully, we can see the complete eradication of racism in America. Now, that may seem a little ambitious, but the progress we're making and the data suggests that we're going down, that these beliefs and that violent crimes and murders are going down tremendously. So these are all positive things right now, and definitely illustrate that right now to be alive is a lot better than being alive 50 years ago. So I hope you guys enjoyed the show. I hope you guys got something out of it. Like always, please subscribe if you enjoyed it. Like, leave a comment, and if you have a topic that you would like me to cover or go more in depth with, just let me know and I'd be happy to do that. All right, you guys have a great day. We'll see you later.